Hey everyone, I'm Dylan Mitchell, and this is the Rincon Horizons podcast. This show is about leadership, what it really takes to grow, adapt, and reach the summit over the course of your leadership journey. Our goal here is simple: to help you lead better so your organization can climb higher. We're picking up right where we left off with Rincon Aerospace Managing Partner Todd Tuttle and Captain Alexander Scribe Armatas. Going back a little bit, looking at your career so far, you've led at a lot of different levels, from smaller operational unit to something like a globally recognized team. What would you say changes about leadership as the responsibility scales? And I guess maybe more importantly, what doesn't change no matter how big the organization or the team gets?
Two very good questions. One thing that I think changes as you develop as a leader, at least hopefully in the correct direction, and we could debate all day about what is good and what is bad leadership, and there's probably not a single two people that would agree across the board on that. But just like anywhere else, certainly in the corporate world, and I'm sure the military is the same way, but you start out with a very small amount of responsibility. My first, official leadership role, if you will, was as a division officer in a fleet squadron with a division of maybe 20 people. Even with those 20 people, I still had a division chief who was my overall supervisor, who was extremely experienced. The chief petty officers in the Navy are the salt of the earth. They've seen things forever and they've been around a long time and are very knowledgeable. Even that baseline experience level, I'm trusting my chief to do a lot of things that I either don't know how to do or am not really suited to do to begin with. That trust just starts out between a division officer and their chief, and that certainly grows as you get more senior, as you move up the chain, as you become a department head, and certainly as a commanding officer. You're still trusting people to do their job and fulfill their role as leaders within a unit. The only thing that what doesn't change is the requirement to trust those folks. I believe the single biggest mistake you can make as a leader is to micromanage. I think micromanagement is the worst thing you can do in leadership. I think it undermines trust. I think it stifles creativity, and I think it sends the worst possible message you can to people with which you operate. With that, my approach has always been, and I think most people's approach, is that you have to trust the people that lead with you when you're in an element. And what changes as you develop, as you go through that career, is the number of people you're trusting. When I was a division officer, I had to trust my chief. I had to trust my leading petty officer, those two people who I knew very well. By the time I was an operational CO, I'm trusting the entire chief's mess, all of our first-class petty officers, all of the other officers in the command. They all are part of the unit, and they all have their own individual roles and responsibilities as leaders. And I'm expecting all of them to do that and do that correctly. I'm not interested in, nor do I have the time to do all of their jobs for them. And I also think if I tried, it would be terrible for everybody involved. So that part changes. The number of people that you're relying on to carry the water, if you will, for both a leader and as an organization in general, grows rapidly as you find yourself responsible for more and more. But what doesn't change is that need. The requirement to trust people other than yourself never goes away. If you ever find yourself in a position where you can't trust anyone but you to do the job, that's a really bad place to be, and it's probably not going to work out very well.
You've talked about how the ready room personality changes overnight when half the officers rotate and other personnel rotate out. When that kind of transition happens, what are, and I guess specifically what were, the first few things that you did to stabilize culture and stabilize that teammate quickly? Because you don't really have a lot of time to play around with, as you said, going straight into flying rapidly.
In the Blue Angels in particular, it's challenging. You show up as a newbie, and for the officers, we show up about 2 months before the end of the season and begin shadowing our counterparts as we prepare. In my case, it was Captain Brian Kesselring was the boss before me, and I basically showed up and just watched what he did and followed him around and learned as much as I possibly could from him. There's more than you could possibly learn in that amount of time, and a lot of it, especially about the demo, you really can't learn until you do it. What that does give you, and it gives everybody on the team, is it gives you an opportunity to see what's going on and pay attention. So to your question, the very first thing I did, and I made it a point to try to be as reserved and as quiet as I possibly could. I just wanted to watch what was happening and try to pick up on every cue I could, watch interactions between different people, and basically get as much as I could out of the interactions from the returning team members and the folks that were there, and learn as much as I could. Once the turnover happened and the ready room personality does change overnight, I think it changes maybe a little bit more during the boss years. Each boss is only a 2-year job, so every other year there's a new boss. When you're sitting at the head of the table and you're the new number one and everyone's kind of watching you for what you're going to do and how you're going to react, I made it a point. I don't know how well I did this. This would be a better question probably for the folks that were on the team with me than it would be for me. But my goal was to make changes that I thought were important for the team, but to do it slowly. The last thing anybody wanted was to have a new boss come in and sit down and be like, all right, here's my list of things. And they're all right now. This is how we're going to change all these things. Because it's very difficult for people to adapt that quickly to major change. It's not to say you can't do it, but if it's not really called for, and in my mind, the only point in which I would do something like that is if I thought not making a change was going to get somebody killed or destroy an airplane. And the team I inherited from Captain Kesselring was in great shape. There was zero concern in my mind that we were on the cusp of something really bad happening. So what that allowed me is it allowed me the time to make these changes, these incremental adjustments to the team, the culture, the things we did. We made some changes, but none of them were urgent and none of them were things that had to change right away or something bad was going to happen.
I would say that even taking that mindset into corporate America, I've seen and watched CEOs transition in and out of roles or companies transition leadership, churches transition leadership, watching how there are changes that people can recognize, say these need to be made, but a good leader knows this is a change that needs to be made. This is not a change that needs to be made today, though. Let's forecast this. Let's put it down the line. Let's put it on the roadmap, but it's not a today thing. And then there are, as you said, the changes that do need to be made today that are, in your case, harmful to a jet or to a pilot or to personnel. And then maybe more in the corporate world, this is harmful to a product or this is harmful to a team. I think that's really good.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think the one of the other challenges that comes with that too is the credibility piece we talked about earlier. That you feel that a little bit more. When I sat down at that table for the first time, day one as boss, and I have not even touched a blue air. Well, I guess I've touched one, but I've not flown a blue airplane. I've not been in the front seat. And I'm flanked by folks in blue flight suits that just finished a 300 days on the road season, 32 show sites, flying demos day in and day out. And to sit there at the head of the table and be like, hey, this is what we're going to do now is very difficult. And it was something that I wasn't really interested in doing until I could get my feet under me and really start to build my own credibility in that ready room and in that job to make sure that they understood it. We made some little changes. Most of them, for me personally, especially, were focused more on the squadron side of things and less on the demo until I could really start to understand the demo and get better at it. And then we made some little changes here and there. The other challenging thing about that job, I just want to bring this up because I think it's fun to think about and worth mentioning. Obviously, we all want to know how we're doing, how we stack up. And it's very interesting because in the Blue Angels in particular, because it's such a unique organization and it's had such a small, certainly compared to the rest of the military, such a small number of people, there's really no way to know how you stack up. I may have been the best boss the Blue Angels have ever had. I also may have been the worst boss the Blue Angels have ever had, which is probably more likely. But there's no way to know that. The only people that can even compare are people that have been on the team with more than one commanding officer. And in most cases, they can compare just those two people. Their time on the team doesn't even spread beyond that. There's no objective measure of the quality of a commanding officer and a flight leader or really a leader in general in an organization like that. It's tough when you're sitting in there and you look at the people that have gone before you and you know they were successful, but you don't know anything more than that. And wondering how you're going to stack up against such an elite group of folks is intimidating for sure.
Wow.
We've talked a lot about the Blue Angels for obvious reasons in this podcast, but I want to make a switch a bit because you've done more things than just the Blue Angels. You've done several combat tours in your career. And I really want to talk about leadership with respect to combat. And if you could compare leadership in combat versus leadership in training versus maybe leadership in the Blue Angels, and does it change? Is it different or is it not? Very few of us have ever led in combat, so I think that insight would really help us.
Sure. I think that's a great question. And I think you'd get a lot of different answers depending on who you ask. Some people would tell you leadership's leadership. It doesn't really matter what you're doing. Personally, for me, it was a little different. I appreciate you reminding folks, by the way, that I've done more than just lead the Blue Angels. I've coming up on 24 years. I've spent 2 of 24 years with the Blue Angels. But as is the tendency, if you're a part of that organization, that tends to be what you'll be known for. I shouldn't complain. There's worse things. But to your question about leadership, I think leadership of any organization is challenging. For me personally, when we went into combat and we started executing actual real world operations, I don't know that my leadership style changed per se, but you certainly start to focus on different things and you very quickly figure out what's really important and what's not as important. As we transition, I've been deployed 7 times now, 6 of which have been what would be considered combat deployments, mostly in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. And we're actually executing real world operations and carrying out tasking that comes from our higher authorities and our leadership. The mindset changes a little bit. When you're training, one of the really beautiful things about training is obviously you can make mistakes and there's very little penalty. You're going to hear about it. You're going to have to debrief it. You're going to have to figure out how to do it better, but nobody gets hurt. Nothing really bad happens. And the intent of that is to train so that when it's time to execute in combat, you don't make those mistakes. I think as a larger organization, the Navy and certainly naval aviation has seen pretty good success in that approach. The old saying, you don't rise to the occasion, you fall to the level of your training. That has been the mindset for naval aviation for a long time. And there are exceptions, but for the overwhelming majority, folks train and train and train and train and learn how to do something very well. And then when they go out and do it in combat, if you do it just like in training, it'll generally work out. There are some differences, though. One of them is that we have a lot of what we call training rules that are intended to limit risk, where riskier evolutions could potentially put people or airplanes in jeopardy. So we have training rules that we follow to make sure that we don't put ourselves in a really risky position during training. Obviously, in combat, those rules don't exist. They are called training rules. And it is something I made it a point to do, is remind folks that training rules don't apply. It's important that you understand when you're in a real combat mission, training rules don't apply. The flip side of that coin is that's also not just a free pass to do something insanely dangerous that you don't really need to do to accomplish the missions. Taking off the handcuffs, if you will, is a good thing in the sense that it allows folks the freedom to do what they need to do to accomplish the mission, but it needs to be tempered with a reminder that you're still a trained professional aviator and you need to make prudent, intelligent decisions based on what you've learned at that point. In that sense, I think combat leadership is a little bit different. And then we talked about priorities. Running a squadron and worrying about there's a lot of administrative requirements and ancillary requirements that come up that are part of running a squadron. When you get into combat ops, those tend to take a back seat, and rightfully so, in my opinion. The paperwork burden, if you will, of being in a squadron sort of goes away while you focus on the task at hand.
Following up with that, what new things did you learn about yourself personally as a pilot or a leader once you were actually put into that combat position?
And this is something probably good for a lot of folks going into combat, but you could certainly expand this to other leadership scenarios. I felt like I did a decent job of preparing myself for some of the more grisly realities of combat operations and what comes with a job like that. I spent a significant amount of time thinking about that stuff and preparing myself to go on a combat deployment. And what I learned about myself is I think that preparation was worthwhile. I think just like training in the aircraft, mentally preparing yourself to do things like that is important. And what that allowed me to do was, at least in my assessment, perform to the level that was required of me as a combat aviator. I don't know that everybody does that. I think most people do. Most people give it some thought. I have had colleagues who have surprised is maybe the wrong word, but have been maybe felt like they were under a lot of pressure to figure out how they were going to handle something that I thought they should have thought about a long time ago. So obviously, when you're talking about combat operations, it is quite literally a matter of life and death in a lot of cases. And if you haven't given much thought to how you're going to handle the life and death reality of combat, the time to do that is not when you're actually in the moment. You've got to be ready for that and prepare ahead of time. So I think there's a lot of parallels to things like that. Certainly, it's a little bit more severe and the penalties are a little more severe in the case of military combat operations, but you could apply that to any number of things.
As we've talked about throughout this show so far, you have spent your career in those environments where life and death are the reality. Whether it's training or not, I think life or death has its place in training as well. You see training accidents happen, not all the time, but enough to be talked about. But in environments where preparation, discipline, even humility, those aren't optional traits necessarily for a leader. Those are things that you have to possess those qualities in order to be a good leader. When you step back and look at all of your experiences over your career, what leadership principles do you think consistently matter the most? If you're boiling it down to the top 5, the top 3, whatever that looks like.
Yeah, I try to remember my 30-second elevator speeches on leadership and how to make it better. And I've accumulated my share of sayings over the years, and hopefully some of them will be of value to people as we talk about this stuff. One thing I stole this from somebody, I don't even remember who, and I've kind of adapted it to my own applications. In my opinion, people really need 2 things to feel like what they're doing is worthwhile, and to feel like when you're in a military unit, you really need to provide everybody with 2 things. They need to feel safe, and they need to feel like what they're doing matters. That may sound simple, but safety is more than just physical safety. It's more than just nobody's going to come in here and hurt me today. There's a lot more to safety than just what we think of in traditional safety sense. People need to feel like they're not going to be treated poorly, treated disrespectfully, physically or emotionally or mentally. People need to feel secure. They need to feel like at any given moment, their boss isn't going to walk through the door and tell them they're fired. They've got to go find a new job. That's all part of feeling safe and secure. People need that. And then the other side of it is people need to feel like what they're doing matters. And you know, the old story, which is I'm sure a story you all have heard before, but it's the classic tale of there was somebody walking around at NASA during the Apollo program days, and they bumped into a janitor who was cleaning one of the hallways and asked, "What are you doing right now?" And he said, "I'm putting somebody on the moon." And that mindset, every single person that's part of an organization is part of that mission, and accomplishing that mission is hugely important. And I spend a lot of time reminding people of that. And there, you know, there are a lot of really junior sailors out there that are doing what feel like menial tasks. They can't see it. And it's my job to remind them, this may feel like a menial, boring, unimportant task, but let me explain to you why this is so important to us. I wasn't always successful. I tried really hard to do that. And sometimes I failed to convince somebody that the job they were doing was important, but I really believe they are. And I think that's something I take a lot of pride in. I think the military is generally pretty good at that. I'm sure some folks that have spent some time in the military will roll their eyes at this, but I don't feel like we have a ton of folks doing stuff just to do stuff. There's usually a reason for it. I won't say that's all true, but I try to avoid having folks working for no reason other than just to work. There needs to be a greater purpose. If there is a greater purpose and they understand that, that's the best of both worlds. That's one approach to leadership. The other one I always tell people, and a question I get a lot, when people ask me about how I would define leadership, I like to use kind of a paraphrasing from a Supreme Court decision from years and years and years ago, when one of the justices, he was actually talking about obscenity and obscene material, but I apply it to leadership. And I would say when it comes to good leadership or bad leadership, I can't really define it, but I know it when I see it. And I think that's true for most folks when they encounter leaders, both good and bad.
Great advice, great description.
You bet.
Scribe, I'm not sure. Hopefully you've gotten to listen to a couple of other episodes of Rincon Horizons, but one of the segments that we do return to on every episode is something we call the Leadership Corner. You've certainly shared your leadership knowledge and some leadership stories along the way, but this segment specifically is a chance to step away from the titles and talk about a moment that actually shaped how you lead, a hard call, a failure, or a lesson that stuck with you. When you think about your leadership journey, not just with the Blue Angels, but just your entire career and even beyond your career, if it happens to be in that area of your life, what story comes to mind?
And I've actually told him this story before, and he of course doesn't remember it, but when I was a training officer in VFA 14, think post-Top Gun, kind of post-FRS instructor, pre-department head, really peak tactical performance at that point. I am at the top of my game in terms of flying the airplane and being a warfighter. And I was in the ready room, and I don't even remember the exchange, but my skipper said something, and I said something back that was not disrespectful, but kind of a little bit contentious, I guess would be a good way to describe it. And the skipper responded to me very quickly in no uncertain words, reminded me who was in charge and what my role was in the command. And at the time, it was a little embarrassing. It hurt my pride a little bit. But as time went on and I kind of looked back on it, what I took away from it, and I think what was really valuable about it, and I still thank him for this to this day, that was a moment for me when I realized that as good as I think I am, and as good as I am in the jet, and as much as I'm developing as a naval aviator and as a leader, I have so much more to learn. And there's so much ahead of me still that I don't know. And there's so much perspective that I don't have, and so many things I have not done. That was something that I still think about to this day when I think I'm on a program like this where I'm talking about leadership like I'm an authority. I've done a lot of things. I've seen a lot of places. I feel like I'm a solid leader. I hope I am, but I'm not finished. I've got a ton to learn, and I learn something new every single day from folks senior to me, folks junior to me, folks older than me, younger than me. Doesn't matter. There are lessons to be learned about leadership and about life in every corner. You'd be amazed how many people will teach you something that you don't think have anything to teach you. And if you're listening and paying attention and just being quiet for a little bit, it's amazing how much you can learn. So that, for me, that moment was really a great reminder that you're never done learning in this business. And the moment you think you've got it all figured out, like I did, you're going to have a bad day. So that was a harsh lesson for me, but one that stuck with me and one that I'm thankful for in the end. I think it's made me better.
I've heard leaders say in the past, And I'm sure it's not a unique thing to have been said, because here you are saying something very similar, but never let yourself believe that you've arrived on your leadership journey, because the moment you think you've arrived, that's where things can start to fall apart. Thank you so much for sharing that story with us.
Of course.
Another segment that we do on every episode of this podcast is just a quick second where we talk about book recommendations. So Todd, as we're thinking about leadership and what that looks like, what book recommendation do you have for us this week?
Dylan, I was thinking, if there was a user guide for doing a podcast with a naval aviator, a Top Gun graduate, a Blue Angel, former Blue Angel boss, it'd probably have a section about what not to do. And it would say, do not recommend a book or talk about a book from an Air Force pilot on the same podcast. But, the podcast is almost over, and I'm thinking it's too late for Scribe to decide he doesn't want to record it. So I'm going to break the rule. Here we go. My recommendation for the book this time is Flying in the Face of Fear, a fighter pilot's lessons on learning with courage, from United States Air Force Colonel retired Kim Casey Campbell. It's based on Colonel Campbell's experience as an A-10 Warhawk pilot in a mission over Baghdad on April 7th, 2003. She was flying close air support for some troops on the ground, and her A-10 took some very heavy enemy fire that caused a complete loss of hydraulic power. We've been talking about Super Hornets that Scribe flies, and how incredible that jet is, and I agree, it's an incredible jet. One of the things the Super Hornet was never designed to do, it was never designed to fly with a complete loss of hydraulic power like the A-10 was. The A-10 was designed to fly without a complete loss of hydraulic power. It's tough to do. And rather than ejecting over enemy territory that day, Colonel Campbell engaged what's called a manual reversion, that system, a backup mode that allows a pilot to fly the jet using mechanical cranks and cables. Think World War I biplane controls. She flew the aircraft, I think it was about an hour out, 300 miles or so from where she took on the enemy fire back to base, and was able to land it safely. The book is a biography of her 24-year military career. She talks about courage and resilience and decision-making in very high-pressure environments and how those skills are necessary in all walks of life. It's interesting. She has a phrase she uses in the book that I think's the same phrase Scribe used earlier. She said she believes that people don't rise to the occasion in difficult situations. She believes you sink to the level of your training. I'll put a link to the book in the show notes. So that's my book this week. And hopefully Scribe won't want to leave now that I've talked about an Air Force pilot.
So Todd, thank you for that book recommendation. It sounds like an awesome book. And personally, I'm probably going to pick it up with an Audible credit after we get off this call. Please send me in a text a link to the book, and we'll put that link, like you said, in the show notes. Scribe, moving on to you. What is a book that's influenced how you think about leadership, or maybe one that you find yourself recommending to others?
Great question. I get questions about that a lot. I am a bit of an aberration in the sense that I'm not a big leadership book reader. I've read one. I didn't particularly care for it, but what I have noticed with leadership books, and I guess what I would offer folks that are interested in books about leadership is, one, there's a ton of them out there. And just remember as you read things like that the advice, if you will, that you get from books like that probably worked very well for the author, but may or may not work for you as the reader. Every leadership book is honest and heartfelt and typically very well researched, and they're all valuable for certain things. But folks that try to read a leadership book and just see it as a recipe for success for themselves individually, I think are going to have a hard time. Leadership is a very personal activity. It's a very personal experience, both for the people leading and the people being led. So leadership books, in my opinion, are great for small nuggets of wisdom, but not necessarily a manual, if you will, for successful leadership.
So Scribe, if I could, maybe I could ask the question a different way. Because I think looking back at your resume, you got a master's degree in management and leadership. Is that right? In addition to the Naval Academy? Okay, so think back, you did something, you studied something. How did you learn leadership in earning that degree? Maybe we'll ask the question that way.
I would argue most of my leadership learning was from experience. I kind of developed my own leadership, and a lot of leadership, in my opinion, is built around just interpersonal relationships and how you interact with people. That's not to say that introverted, reserved people can't be good leaders. They certainly can. In fact, I myself find that I'm typically on the introverted side of the scale. It's also not to say very extroverted social people are always going to be good leaders, but it's important to know that your ability to interact, leadership is interacting with people. That's people are led and people lead, and the ability to interact and communicate and do all of those things in interpersonal relationships are really the core of leadership. For me personally, a lot of that stuff was just learned on the job. I was fortunate enough to be placed in positions and opportunities that allowed me to lead and to occasionally fail as a leader and to learn from that and to improve. That was really where I got a lot of my own personal leadership background. As far as the academic side of it, there's academic leadership stuff. Everybody wants to turn leadership into a recipe and to be able to write about leadership and create a framework to explain leadership, explain the different types of leadership, the good ones, the bad ones, things like that. Probably the reason there's so many leadership books in the world is because you can't really capture it all, certainly not in one book, but everybody views leadership differently. Everybody executes leadership differently. Everybody receives leadership differently. Understanding yourself as a leader, understanding the people you lead, and understanding the differences there is really where you make your money, in my opinion, as a leader. And that's really what I focused on. To apply a little bit of what I got from the degree, that would most closely probably align with situational leadership is one type of leadership that is frequently discussed and described in that sense. I think I'm probably the closest to that type of leader of any of the kind of common styles, but even trying to apply a label to leadership is extremely difficult and is going to miss the mark in most cases.
And thank you. And I think that's part of that practical leadership we talked about at the top of the podcast. So I think that's good advice.
Scribe, for leaders listening to this podcast today, especially those maybe stepping into higher pressure or higher visibility roles, what advice do you wish you'd been given earlier?
That's a great question, and one that would take some thought to really get a good one, but probably something I have figured out more recently that I wished I had been able to articulate better earlier, which maybe aligns with this question a little bit. Understanding that and I mentioned micromanagement earlier and how much I loathe micromanagement. It's important that people understand that not micromanaging, avoiding micromanagement comes at a cost. And that cost is that there's some risk there. In my opinion, the tendency to micromanage is typically born from one of a couple things. Either people just inherently don't trust the people around them, or they are so concerned about their own success and about looking bad that the only way to control that and to maintain control of an organization or a group of folks is to do everything themselves. Obviously, I don't think I need to go too far into the weeds on how that can be bad for a group of people being led. But to be able to step back and not do that requires you to trust people to lead. But it also means that you're going to have to accept when they make mistakes. There is risk in not micromanaging. The folks that are under your charge that are also themselves leaders and leading within your organization are going to make mistakes. They're not going to be perfect. It is very important. Maybe the advice I wish I'd gotten earlier was that you need to give some thought to how you're going to handle that. How do you handle somebody who is doing their very best within your organization that you're responsible for, and they make a mistake? And how do you keep them moving in the right direction? How do you help them grow as a leader without derailing the entire mission for the organization or the military unit or whatever you're talking about? Teaching other leaders and helping them along in the same way people helped me along back in the day is something I wish I'd been able to give more thought to earlier, and probably some advice that would have been helpful.
You're really going to make us work for, finding the right quote to post to publicize the podcast. There's a lot of good stuff.
A lot of great stuff. You're right. It's going to be a tough edit here, I think.
It seems like a good problem to have. Hopefully that's helpful.
It's a good problem to have. You're right.
On that note, final thoughts, Todd, as we're closing and landing this plane. Any closing thoughts you want to leave leaders with who are listening today?
I guess I just want to say, as I said at the top, it's going to be a very practical podcast. I think it was. And I just want to thank Scribe for taking his time. I'm sure he's got a lot of better things to do than talk to a couple of us on a podcast today, but we really appreciate his time coming on and doing that. And more than that, I just want to say thank you for his service to our country, him and his family, and for all the things they do to keep us safe and free.
You bet. It was really my honor. I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you, and I hope that some of this was worthwhile. It's there's a lot of stuff out there, and everyone's trying to learn and get better, and hopefully we help some folks do that. Thanks for having me.
Scribe, we're going to give you the last word for the show. If someone only remembers one sentence from this whole conversation, what would you want it to be?
Micromanagement is the worst thing you can do as a leader. It undermines trust, it stifles creativity, and it sends the worst possible message you can to folks that are counting on you to lead them.
Thank you so much, Scribe. Thank you, Todd. And thank you to everyone who's listening, especially. In every episode of Rincon Horizons, we unpack the moments and decisions that shape us as leaders at work, at home, and everywhere in between. Our goal is simple: to help you lead better so your organization can climb higher. If today's conversation sparked something for you, share it with a friend or a colleague who's on their own leadership journey. You can find more about Rincon Aerospace or connect with Todd using the links in the show notes or at Rincon, that's RINCON.aero. I'm Dylan Mitchell. You can learn more about my work at DM.supply. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time on Rincon Horizons.